right. So you sent over like a ton of articles about this potential ceasefire deal going on in Gaza. And I have to say, some of these images are just really striking. There's one in particular um, of a woman in Gaza, and she's baking bread like right there in the rubble of her destroyed home. It's just
Yeah.
you know, powerful. It makes you think about the resilience of people even when faced with like utter devastation.
Yeah. It really speaks to the human cost of this whole conflict, doesn't
Yeah.
it? With this ceasefire, we're kind of seeing this mix of relief and skepticism and apprehension all kind of tangled up together.
Exactly. It's like everyone's holding their breath, wondering if this time it's actually going to be different. We're talking about potentially ending this brutal 15-month war, a possible release of like nearly 100 hostages, including Americans. There's just so much writing on this. So where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with what we know for sure. We have multiple sources confirming this ceasefire deal,
Yeah.
the U.S., Qatar. Even President-elect Trump is already claiming a victory. It's supposed to start Sunday, January 19th.
Yeah.
But even with all that confirmation, there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Right. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office is being very cautious. They're saying the final details are still being ironed out. And, this isn't the first time we've seen a ceasefire attempt in this conflict.
Exactly. And to understand why there's so much apprehension this time, we really need to remember what led to this war in the first place. That horrific attack on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched this surprise offensive, killed over 1,000 people, took over 200 hostages. It just sent shockwaves through Israel and really changed the dynamics of this whole conflict.
That attack was absolutely devastating. And I can only imagine the pain and fear so many people are feeling. And you mentioned skepticism. Why are some people hesitant to believe that this ceasefire will actually stick?
Well, Hamas has a history of violating these agreements, and there's deep mistrust on both sides. Plus, you have the internal politics in Israel. Netanyahu is facing pressure from his own right-wing coalition members, some of whom see this deal as too favorable to Hamas. They're particularly concerned about the planned release of Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah, we've seen reports that Israel might release around 1,000 prisoners in exchange for the hostages. That's a significant number, and I imagine it raises serious questions about the potential security implications.
Absolutely. And this is where understanding Hamas's motivations becomes really crucial. While some might see this prisoner release as a win for Hamas, it also fits into their broader strategy. They've consistently framed themselves as fighters for Palestinian liberation. And securing the release of these prisoners plays directly into that narrative. It allows them to present themselves as these champions who can deliver concrete results, which could potentially strengthen their political standing.
That's a fascinating point. So it's not just about scoring a win in the immediate term, but about playing this long game, reinforcing their image and potentially bolstering their influence in the long run.
Precisely. And that's why the international community is watching this deal so closely. There are concerns that concessions like this, while potentially bringing an end to the immediate violence, might inadvertently empower Hamas in the long run, making a lasting peace even harder to achieve.
It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it? Trying to address the immediate humanitarian crisis, while also being mindful of the potential long-term consequences. And speaking of the humanitarian situation, I keep thinking back to that image of the woman baking bread in the rubble. It really brings home the scale of devastation in Gaza.
Yeah, it's estimated that over 90% of the population in Gaza has been displaced by this war. The destruction is immense, and the need for aid is critical. Rebuilding homes infrastructure, the healthcare system, it's a monumental task.
And there's also the psychological impact of this conflict, the trauma, the fear, the uncertainty. Even if the physical rebuilding can happen, how do you even begin to heal those wounds?
It's a long and complex process, one that requires a tremendous amount of resources and commitment. And it's not just about providing aid or rebuilding structures, it's about addressing the root causes of the conflict, fostering dialogue, building trust, and ultimately creating an environment where peace can flourish.
So this ceasefire, if it holds, is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. And to understand the intricacies of that puzzle, we need to dig deeper into the roles played by different international actors, the political landscape both within Israel and Palestine, and the complex dynamics that fuel this conflict.
Which is precisely what we'll be doing in the next part of our deep dive. But before we move on, I want to talk about the celebrations we've seen in Gaza. There are reports of gunmen driving around in jeeps, firing into the air, chanting victory slogans. It's a stark contrast to the cautious optimism we're hearing from Israel.
Yes. And understanding that contrast is crucial. The way both sides are framing this deal reveals a lot about their underlying motivations and anxieties. For Hamas, these celebrations, while alarming to some, are a deliberate show of strength. It feeds into their narrative of resistance and reinforces their claim to be the true protectors of the Palestinian people.
It's a powerful message, especially for their supporters. But I'm also curious about the language being used. One analyst described these celebrations as another Al-Aqsa Storm victory, directly referencing that October 7th attack. What are the implications of that kind of rhetoric?
Well, the Al-Aqsa storm attack was a turning point in this conflict. And by invoking that imagery, Hamas is sending a clear message, not only to Israel, but to the entire region. They're essentially saying that despite the ceasefire, their fight continues, and they're willing to use force to achieve their goals. It's a message that resonates with their base. But it also raises concerns about the long-term stability of any peace agreement.
Right. It seems like even amidst this hope for peace, there's this deep-seated fear that the cycle of violence might just repeat itself.
It's a valid concern. And to understand whether this ceasefire represents a genuine turning point or just a temporary pause, we need to delve deeper into the nuances of the deal itself and the broader geopolitical forces at play.
Okay, so we've talked about the internal pressures on both sides, the potential long-term implications for Hamas and that looming humanitarian crisis. But this whole situation isn't happening in a vacuum. We have to talk about the international players, right? Because they've got a huge stake in all of this.
Absolutely. The international community has been deeply involved in trying to broker peace in this region for decades. And this ceasefire is no exception. You got the U.S., Qatar, Egypt, all trying to exert their influence and push for some kind of resolution.
And it's interesting because their interests don't always align perfectly. We were talking earlier about Qatar's role as a mediator. They've invested heavily in trying to position themselves as this neutral party. But their close ties to Hamas definitely raise some eyebrows, don't they?
Right. It's a delicate balancing act for Qatar. They provided significant financial aid to Gaza, which gives them some leverage with Hamas, but it also fuels those accusations from Israel and others that they're playing both sides.
And then you have the United States, which has historically been Israel's strongest ally. But even there, things seem to be shifting a bit, right? Especially with President-elect Trump taking a more active role.
Trump's involvement in these final negotiations has certainly ruffled some feathers. He's already claiming credit for the deal, and his past statements suggest a more hardline stance in favor of Israel. It's unclear how that might impact future negotiations, or that delicate balance of power in the region.
And we can't forget about Egypt, which shares a border with both Israel and Gaza. Their stability is directly tied to what happens in this conflict.
Exactly. Egypt has been instrumental in facilitating previous ceasefires and controlling the flow of goods and people in and out of Gaza. They've got a vested interest in preventing this conflict from escalating and spilling over their own borders.
So you've got all these international actors with their own agendas and priorities, all trying to influence the outcome of this ceasefire. It's a complex web of relationships, to say the least.
And it's not just about the political maneuvering. The international community also plays a crucial role in providing humanitarian aid and supporting the rebuilding effort in Gaza, which, as we've discussed, is a massive undertaking.
Right. We've got reports from various organizations on the ground, like the UN and the Red Cross, painting a pretty grim picture. Thousands of homes destroyed, critical infrastructure crippled, the healthcare system just overwhelmed. And on top of all that, the trauma and displacement of over 90% of the population.
It's a dire situation, and the need for immediate assistance is critical. But as you pointed out earlier, there are also concerns about how that aid is distributed and whether it actually reaches those who need it most.
Yeah, there's a long history of corruption and mismanagement in Gaza, and there are fears that some of this aid could be diverted or misused.
Right, and it's not just a question of getting the aid in. It's about ensuring that it's used effectively and transparently to rebuild homes, restore essential services, and create a sustainable foundation for recovery.
And that ties back to the question of who controls Gaza, because as long as Hamas remains in power, there are doubts about their willingness to cooperate with international efforts and ensure that aid reaches its intended recipients.
It's a difficult balance. On the one hand, you have the urgent need to address this humanitarian crisis. On the other hand, you have concerns about legitimizing Hamas and potentially strengthening their grip on power.
And some argue that providing aid without addressing those underlying political issues is just putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound, that it's only a matter of time before that cycle of violence erupts again.
It's a valid concern. A lasting solution requires addressing the root causes of the conflict, fostering political dialogue, and creating a framework for peaceful coexistence. And that's where diplomacy comes in.
Right, and that brings us back to the role of those international players we were talking about earlier, because they're not just providing aid, they're also trying to facilitate negotiations and push for a more permanent resolution.
Exactly. Diplomacy is crucial in this situation. It's about building trust, bridging divides, and finding creative solutions that address the concerns of all parties involved. And that takes time, patience, and a willingness to compromise.
And let's be honest, there have been plenty of failed attempts at diplomacy in this conflict. So why should this time be any different? What makes this ceasefire more promising than the ones that have come before?
Well, it's true that there's no guarantee of success, but there are some factors that suggest this could be a genuine turning point. First, you have the unprecedented involvement of President-elect Trump, which, while controversial, adds a new dynamic to the equation. Second, you have the increasing pressure from the international community for a lasting solution, particularly in light of that devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And finally, you have the exhaustion and war weariness on both sides, which might create a more receptive environment for dialogue and compromise.
So it's a combination of factors,
Right.
both internal and external, that are creating this window of opportunity. But as we've discussed, there are also significant challenges ahead. The mistrust runs deep, the political divisions are entrenched, and the potential for spoilers on both sides is real.
Absolutely. It's a fragile situation, and it's crucial to manage expectations. This ceasefire deal is not a magic bullet. It's a step in the right direction. But it's just the first step on a long and winding road towards peace.
Okay, so let's assume for a moment that this ceasefire does hold and that the guns fall silent. What happens next? What are the practical steps involved in actually implementing this deal and moving towards a more sustainable peace?
Well, the agreement calls for kind of a phased approach. The first step, as we've discussed, is the release of hostages and the simultaneous cessation of hostilities. Once that's achieved, the focus shifts to the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the opening of border crossings to allow for the flow of humanitarian aid and essential goods.
And this is where things could get tricky, because there's a lot of skepticism about whether Hamas will actually uphold their end of the bargain. They've violated previous ceasefires, and there's a concern that they might use this pause in the fighting to rearm and regroup.
It's a valid concern. And that's why the role of international monitors and peacekeeping forces will be crucial in ensuring compliance and preventing any escalation of violence.
Right. And there's also the question of rebuilding Gaza. As we've discussed, the scale of destruction is immense, and it's going to require this massive international effort to get things back on track.
We're talking about billions of dollars in aid. And the logistics of coordinating that effort, ensuring accountability and preventing corruption are incredibly complex.
And it's not just about rebuilding physical structures. It's about addressing the trauma, the psychological wounds, the deep-seated fear and mistrust that this conflict has created.
Absolutely. True peace goes beyond the absence of violence. It's about creating a society where people feel safe, secure, and hopeful about the future. And that requires addressing those underlying social, economic, and political grievances that fuel this conflict.
So we're talking about a long-term process, one that requires sustained commitment from both sides, as well as the international community. And even then, there's no guarantee of success.
That's right. But the alternative, a continuation of that cycle of violence and suffering, is simply unacceptable. So while we acknowledge the challenges and the uncertainties, we also have to hold on to that glimmer of hope that this ceasefire represents. Because peace, however elusive, is always worth striving for.
Well said. And that brings us to another crucial element in all of this, the role of media. Because the way this conflict is portrayed, the narratives that are spun, the images that are shown, all of that has a profound impact on public opinion and the prospects for peace.
Absolutely. The media plays a powerful role in shaping perceptions, influencing policy, and even fueling the conflict itself. And in the age of social media, where information spreads like wildfire, it's more important than ever to be critical consumers of news and to be aware of the potential for bias and manipulation.
Which is precisely what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. But before we jump into that, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the need to address the root causes of this conflict. Because while this ceasefire might offer a temporary respite from the violence, those deeper issues, the historical grievances, the political deadlocks, those haven't gone away.
You're absolutely right. And to understand the complexities of this conflict, to truly grasp the challenges of achieving a lasting peace, we need to delve into those deeper issues to unravel the historical threads that have led us to this point.
You know, as we dive into this media landscape, I'm struck by just how differently this conflict is portrayed depending on where you look.
Okay.
Some of the articles you sent over focus heavily on the trauma in Israel, the families waiting for their loved ones to be released, that constant fear of rocket attacks. Others highlight the devastation in Gaza, the humanitarian crisis, the anger at what they see as Israeli aggression. It's almost like you're talking about two completely separate realities.
It really is a testament to the power of narrative,
Yeah.
isn't it? Each side has its own story to tell, its own way of framing the conflict, and the media often reflects those deeply ingrained perspectives.
Yeah, one thing that really stood out to me was the language used. Some sources refer to Hamas as militants or even terrorists, while others call them freedom fighters or resistance groups. That choice of words alone shapes how people perceive the entire situation.
Absolutely. The words we use carry immense weight, especially in a conflict as emotionally charged as this one. And it's not just about individual words, it's about the overall narrative that's being constructed. For example, some outlets focus heavily on the security threats posed by Hamas, highlighting their rocket attacks and their refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist.
Right. And that narrative often leads to the conclusion that Israel has no choice but to defend itself, even if it means using overwhelming military force.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have outlets that emphasize the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, highlighting the occupation, the settlements, the restrictions on movement, and the daily indignities faced by Palestinians living under Israeli control.
And that narrative often leads to the conclusion that Hamas is simply fighting back against an oppressive force, that they're the underdog in this David versus Goliath struggle.
Both narratives contain elements of truth, of course. And that's what makes this so complex. It's not a simple case of good versus evil. It's a clash of two deeply rooted narratives, each with its own history, its own grievances, its own sense of victimhood.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how anyone can possibly form an objective opinion when they're bombarded with these competing narratives, each one claiming to be the truth.
Right. That's where critical thinking becomes essential. It's about recognizing that every source has a perspective, that no one is completely neutral, and that it's our responsibility to seek out multiple viewpoints, to compare and contrast different narratives, and to question the assumptions that underpin them.
And that's especially challenging in the age of social media, where information spreads so quickly and where it's often difficult to distinguish fact from fiction.
Absolutely. We've seen countless examples of misinformation and propaganda and outright fake news being spread on social media, often with the intent of inflaming tensions and demonizing the other side.
I remember seeing this photo during the last escalation that claimed to show Hamas fighters celebrating the deaths of Israeli children. It turned out to be a completely fabricated image, but it had already gone viral and fueled this wave of hatred and anger.
That's the danger of these echo chambers, where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing biases. It makes it even harder to have a nuanced and informed conversation about the conflict.
So what's the solution? How do we navigate this minefield of information, especially when it comes to such a complex and emotionally charged issue like this?
Well, the first step is awareness. We need to be conscious of our own biases, the sources we rely on, and the filters through which we view the world. And then it's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives, challenging our own assumptions, and being willing to engage with viewpoints that make us uncomfortable.
It sounds like it takes a lot of work, but I guess that's the price of true understanding.
It is work, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Because when we step outside of our echo chambers, when we engage with different perspectives, we open ourselves up to this whole new world of understanding. We start to see the humanity on both sides,
Yeah.
the shared hopes and fears, the common ground that often gets obscured by the conflict.
And that's what gives me hope. Because ultimately, peace can only be built on understanding, on empathy, on recognizing the other as a human being, not just an enemy.
I completely agree. And while the media can often be a force for division and polarization, it can also be this powerful tool for building bridges, for fostering understanding, for promoting peace. It all depends on how we choose to use it.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Gaza ceasefire, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and expertise.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has provided you with a more nuanced understanding of this complex conflict, the challenges ahead, and the glimmers of hope that the ceasefire represents. It's a fragile peace, but one worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us.